Abio 3, 17 a.m., September 1941. The time mattered because everything else had stopped keeping it. Above the white cliffs, the night sky over Dover was intermittently torn open by searchlights and distant explosions. But down here, deep inside, the chalk time moved differently. It did not rush. It did not flee. It waited. 23 meters below the cliff edge, the war arrived not as fire or sound, but as pressure, a weight pressing inward from all sides. The officer standing at the top of the spiral stairway knew the hour without looking at his watch. He could feel it in the rhythm of the guns above, in the pauses between air raid sirens, in the way the sea wind surged and retreated like breath being held. Fan Bay Battery was awake. The guns were manned, and beneath them the shelter waited unfinished, damp-smelling of raw chalk and wet concrete, but already essential. This was not a place for heroics. It was a place built on the assumption that sooner or later the bombs would find their mark. He paused at the threshold where the stairway dropped into darkness. The shelter was officially operational, but it still felt provisional, as if the ground itself had not yet decided whether to accept what had been carved into it. The chalk walls were pale and closed the air, noticeably cooler than the night outside. Somewhere far below, water dripped steadily, marking seconds more faithfully than any clock. He switched on his torch. The beam cut across the first turn of the spiral stair, catching the rough edge where chalk met poured concrete. The light did not travel far. It bent, disappeared, reappeared again, as the stair twisted downward as if the shelter were deliberately concealing its depth. The wind followed him inside, drawn down from the cliff face, funneling through the entrance and racing past his boots. It carried the smell of salt and diesel and something older earth that had not seen daylight since before the war, before the city above it, before the guns. He took one step down, then another. With each footfall, the sound changed. Above-ground noise scattered, here it returned. His boots struck the steps, and the echo came back heavier, slower, multiplied. There were no voices below, no machinery, yet running no signs of life beyond the faint glimmer of moisture on the walls. Only space, descending in tight circles, and the steady sensation of being enclosed. He became acutely aware of his breathing, of the narrowness of the stair, of the thickness of the earth between himself and the open sky. Halfway down, he stopped. Not because he was afraid, but because instinct demanded a pause. This was the last point where turning back felt easy. Above him was the night air, the guns, the noise of war. Below him was something else entirely, a controlled darkness designed to endure. He rested his hand against the wall. The chalk was cold, slightly damp, unyielding. This was what they were trusting with their lives. Not speed, not firepower. Depth. He imagined the men who would soon sleep here shoulder to shoulder on iron bunks, listening to the distant thud of bombs they could not see. He imagined the shelter filled with bodies, breath tension and waiting, and he imagined the moment when the earth above them would shake hard enough to make even this place feel thin. If bombs fell right now, there would be no running, no return to the surface, only the long descent and the hope that what had been built into the cliff was enough. If bombs fell right now, the only thing protecting them would be 23 meters of chalk and concrete. By the time the stairway ended, the surface world no longer felt real. The descent was not dramatic, not sudden. It was gradual, deliberate, engineered, to separate what happened above from what would endure below. 23 meters down, the temperature settled into something constant, cooler than the night air on the cliffs, cooler than summer, warmer than winter, a steady chill that belonged not to weather but to depth. The air was heavy with damp. It carried the unmistakable scent of chalk dust mixed with salt, as if the sea itself had found a way to breathe through the rock. Moisture clung to the walls and collected along the edges of the floor, forming shallow pools that reflected torchlight in dull, broken fragments. Every surface absorbed light rather than returned it. The concrete was unfinished, raw, poured quickly and without ornament. Finger marks from wooden molds were still visible in places. This was not architecture meant to impress, it was meant to last. The passageway narrowed as it extended forward straight for a few meters, before bending slightly, forcing the body to adjust its sense of direction. The ceiling pressed low enough that even an average man became aware of his posture. Shoulders tightened, neck lowered. The space demanded submission without saying so aloud. There were no windows, no vents opening to daylight, no hint of the sky. Artificial light had not yet been installed everywhere, leaving long sections of corridor to be discovered only by torch. Darkness here was not complete, but it was patient waiting just beyond the reach of illumination. Each step echoed. The sound did not disperse. It returned, elongated, layered upon itself. Footsteps became company, followed by their own delayed repetition. The shelter magnified presence while denying companionship. One person sounded like several. Several would sound like a crowd. Silence, when it came, felt heavier than noise. Water dripped somewhere unseen. Not urgently. Not steadily enough to measure time with certainty. Just often enough to remind anyone listening that the cliff was alive, that it breathed, slowly seeping through the spaces cut into it. Chalk had been chosen because it could be carved quickly, because it absorbed shock, because it held. But chalk also remembered water. It remembered pressure. It remembered centuries. The corridors branched. One led toward sleeping quarters not yet fully fitted. Another opened toward rooms designated for medical use, marked only by chalk lines on the wall and handwritten notes nailed temporarily to wood frames. Farther on, a space widened slightly, intended for machinery that had not yet arrived. Even unfinished, the logic of the place was clear. Everything had a purpose. Nothing was accidental. There was no space for wandering, only for passing through. At this depth, the absence of natural light became more than a condition, it became a presence. The body noticed it immediately. Without sunrise or sunset, time flattened. Minutes stretched. Hours lost their shape. The shelter existed in a permanent state of readiness, untethered from the rhythms that governed life above. The men who would occupy it would sleep without dawn wake, without morning, and wait without knowing how long waiting would be required. It did not feel like a fortress. There were no firing positions here, no embrasures cut toward the enemy. The walls were thick, but not proud. Their strength lay in their refusal to engage. They absorbed rather than resisted. This was not a place designed to fight back. It was designed to endure being struck. The body responded to the space in subtle ways. Breathing slowed. Movements became economical. The weight of the cliff overhead was not crushing, but it was always present, a constant reminder that everything here existed by permission of the earth. The mind did not imagine sudden collapse or dramatic failure. Instead, it lingered on a quieter fear, the idea of remaining here too long, of becoming part of the structure itself, unnoticed, unchanging. There were no monsters hiding in the dark, no unknown creatures waiting beyond the beam of a torch. The fear came from something far more ordinary. From the knowledge that once sealed, this place would continue exactly as it was, regardless of who remained inside. The walls would not care if men slept or died against them. The water would continue to gather. The echoes would repeat footsteps long after the feet that made them were gone. And yet, this was where they had chosen to survive. The shelter existed because of a calculation made above ground in offices and command rooms in response to maps and casualty figures. It was built during a moment when the island understood itself to be alone. Across the channel lay occupied Europe. In the skies above, bombers crossed nightly. Dover stood at the edge of the country, close enough to the enemy to hear them, far enough to fear what would come next. Fan Bay Deep Shelter was not an act of optimism. It was an act of acceptance. Acceptance that the war would not be won quickly. Acceptance that destruction would arrive faster than relief. Acceptance that survival might depend not on victory, but on the ability to wait underground while the world above burned and endured. This was not a place to fight. This was a place to wait. In 1940, Britain learned what it meant to be exposed. France had fallen with a speed that stunned even its allies. Across the channel, the coastline that had once marked distance now felt uncomfortably close. German aircraft crossed the narrow stretch of water with ease, probing defenses, striking ports, rail yards, cities. The Battle of Britain was not fought along a single front. It unfolded everywhere at once, over airfields, above towns, across harbors, and along the southern edge of the island, where land simply stopped. Dover sat at that edge. It was not merely a town. It was a threshold. From its cliffs on clear days, one could see the occupied continent. That proximity made it symbolic, but it also made it vulnerable. The channel was no longer a moat. It was a corridor. Every radar contact, every distant engine sound carried the same question: was this reconnaissance or the beginning of something larger? Air raids became routine. Sirens cut through nights already shortened by blackout. Bombs fell not only to destroy infrastructure but to wear down resolve. The German strategy was clear enough to those watching from the ground: break the Royal Air Force, disrupt production, shake civilian morale, and keep Britain uncertain about when the next attack would come, and whether the island could endure alone. This was the environment in which Fanbay took shape, not as an afterthought and not as a gesture of reassurance, but as a response to the reality that the war might not move on quickly. Dover was expected to hold. Its guns were expected to fire, and the men who served them were expected to remain at their posts, even as the skies above them burned. Fanbay Battery was one of several coastal artillery positions constructed to defend the channel approaches. Its guns faced outward, covering the sea lanes ready to engage enemy vessels should an invasion be attempted. But artillery did not operate in isolation. Guns required crews. Crews required rest, medical care supplies, and protection. Above-ground positions could be destroyed or rendered unusable by bombing. The solution was not to harden them endlessly, but to place the life of the battery somewhere bombs could not easily reach. That place was underground. The cliffs at Fanbay were composed of chalk, soft enough to excavate quickly, yet dense enough to absorb shock. Engineers cut into the cliff face, and then deeper still, carving a network of tunnels and chambers that followed the logic of function rather than comfort. Depth was measured carefully. Too shallow and bombs could penetrate. Too deep and construction time would stretch beyond what the war allowed. The final depth, approximately 23 meters, represented a compromise between speed and survival. The shelter was built to serve hundreds of men, not civilians, not families, not refugees, but trained artillery crews operating on rotating shifts. Inside space was allocated for rows of iron bunk beds stacked close together, maximizing capacity over privacy. A medical area was set aside, modest but functional, capable of treating injuries caused by blasts, accidents, or exhaustion. A machinery room housed generators and equipment essential to keeping the shelter operational. Storage areas held food, tools, and supplies calculated not for comfort, but for continuity. Everything about the shelter spoke the language of military planning. Corridors were narrow to reduce blast pressure. Rooms were arranged with efficiency in mind. There was no ornamentation, no attempt to soften the environment. The walls were bare concrete. The ceilings were low. The air was controlled but never generous. This was infrastructure, not refuge. That distinction mattered. Civilian shelters were built to reassure populations, to provide temporary relief during raids. Fanbay Deep Shelter was something else entirely. It was designed to keep a fighting unit intact under sustained attack. Its purpose was not to protect life for its own sake, but to ensure that the guns above could continue to function day after day, night after night, regardless of what fell from the sky. The men who used it understood that difference instinctively. They were not hiding. They were withdrawing between shifts, descending into the cliff, not to escape the war, but to remain part of it. The shelter allowed them to eat, sleep, and tend to the wounded without abandoning their positions. It bought them time. Time to recover. Time to wait for the next alarm. Life inside the shelter followed rhythms dictated by duty rather than daylight. Crews rotated between the guns and the underground spaces below. Sleep came in fragments. Conversations were muted not out of fear of noise, discipline, but because the space itself discouraged excess. There was little room for wandering thought. The environment demanded focus. It stripped experience down to essentials: fatigue, hunger, anticipation. Letters from home were read and reread under artificial light. Small personal items, photographs, pocket knives, watches, took on outsized importance in a place where nothing changed unless someone made it change. The shelter was never meant to feel permanent, yet it fostered a strange sense of suspension, as if the men inside existed slightly outside the normal flow of time. They knew the war might last years. They knew an invasion might come or might not. What they did not know was how much of themselves would be spent simply waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for raids to end, waiting for the sound of engines overhead to fade. Fan Bay Deep Shelter was built on the understanding that Britain could not afford collapse. Not physical collapse alone, but organizational collapse, the loss of cohesion, of readiness, of the ability to continue functioning under pressure. The shelter was insurance against that failure, a place to preserve structure when chaos threatened to overwhelm it. Britain did not build these tunnels to win quickly. They built them to ensure they did not break. Time did not erase Fan Bay Deep Shelter when it was sealed. It preserved it. The first clue lay in the most ordinary of objects, the remains of daily life. Iron bunk frames still lined sections of the sleeping quarters, their paint flaking, their edges dulled by decades of moisture. They were arranged with precision, stacked close, leaving just enough space for a man to sit upright, without striking the frame above him. No attempt had been made to soften the metal or disguise its purpose. These were not beds meant for rest. They were platforms for endurance. On the steps leading down into the shelter, the stone itself told a quieter story. The center of each stair was worn slightly deeper than the edges smoothed by countless boots, descending and ascending along the same narrow line. Even in a place designed for waiting, movement had been constant. The layout of rooms followed a deliberate logic, sleeping areas grouped tightly. Medical space set apart, technical rooms placed where vibration and heat would not interfere with rest. Someone had thought carefully about how bodies would move through this space under pressure. The question lingered: how long did they expect those bodies to remain here? The second clue appeared on the walls, not everywhere, and not loudly. Names scratched into chalk and concrete, sometimes barely legible. Initials followed by surnames, dates without explanation. Simple vertical lines grouped in sets of 5, then broken, then resumed elsewhere. There were no speeches carved here, no declarations of purpose or defiance. Just marks, evidence that time had been counted, not celebrated. One name repeated in different locations, as if its owner had moved through the shelter and wanted proof he had been there at all. Some inscriptions sat low on the wall, carved while seated. Others were higher, scratched quickly, unevenly perhaps, during a moment when standing still felt difficult. None of them explained themselves. They did not need to. They asked their own questions. How many nights passed before those lines stopped? How many men needed to leave a name behind simply to confirm their own existence? The third clue was quieter still, hidden in the technical spaces. Old electrical cables ran along walls and ceilings, secured with brackets designed for long-term use. The insulation had hardened with age, but the layout remained intact, suggesting systems meant to be relied upon, not improvised. Switch mounts, conduit paths, generator housings, everything pointed to infrastructure built to operate continuously, not intermittently. This was not a shelter meant to be occupied only during raids. It was meant to function as a living system capable of sustaining activity over extended periods. The machinery rooms were placed with care, separated from sleeping areas, shielded from vibration. The attention given to these details raised an uncomfortable possibility. Shelters designed solely for emergency use are simple. They favor speed over longevity. Fan Bay did not. Why build something so technically complete if it was only ever meant to be temporary? The fourth clue was the most unsettling because it was defined by absence. Some corridors ended abruptly at locked doors. Others branched away from the main routes and disappeared into darkness, their entrances barred or deliberately obscured. There were no signs explaining their purpose, no diagrams displayed for visitors, no clear indication of what lay beyond. Even when the shelter was reopened decades later, these sections remained closed, their contents undocumented to the public. The geometry of the place hinted that these were not mistakes or abandoned construction. They aligned too cleanly. They followed the same structural logic as the accessible areas. They belonged to the original plan. Whatever function they served, it was one deemed unnecessary or unsuitable to reveal. That silence carried weight. Military spaces rarely include redundancy without reason. Why design areas that would later require concealment? Taken together, the clues formed no single answer. They resisted neat conclusions. Each suggested intention without explanation, planning without confession. Fan Bay Deep Shelter presented itself as practical, efficient, unremarkable, and yet The more closely it was examined, the harder it became to accept that simplicity at face value. If the shelter existed only to protect men from falling bombs, why preserve power systems capable of extended operation? Why separate spaces so carefully, as if preparing for long occupation rather than brief refuge? Why leave behind a structure that felt less like a temporary haven and more like a self-contained environment? And why decades later were some doors still kept closed? The shelter did not answer these questions. It did not need to. Its walls were not built to explain themselves. They were built to hold. What remained was not a secret waiting to be uncovered, but a set of deliberate choices, frozen in concrete and chalk. Choices made under pressure, guided by fears that were never fully written down. If this place was only meant to shield men from bombs, then its complexity was unnecessary. And if it was not, then what else had been planned here, beneath the cliffs, where time could be slowed and the surface world held at a distance? At some point, the shelter stops feeling purely defensive and begins to feel anticipatory, not in the sense of hidden weapons or forbidden experiments, but in the quieter, more unsettling way that careful planning reveals intent. Fan Bay Deep Shelter does not suggest panic. It suggests rehearsal. One reasonable hypothesis is that the shelter was designed as a contingency command space, a place where operations could continue if surface positions were compromised. Dover was not just a firing point, it was a nerve ending. Coastal batteries coordinated with radar stations, naval patrols, and air defenses. If communications above ground failed, an underground environment with protected power space for staff and separation of functions could allow command continuity. The layout supports this idea. Technical rooms are isolated. Movement through corridors is controlled. Noise and vibration are managed. This is consistent with a facility expected to remain operational under sustained stress. Another possibility lies in endurance rather than command. Fan Bay may have been intended to support prolonged combat readiness if the situation worsened beyond air raids. In 1940 and 1941, the threat of invasion was not theoretical. Operation Sea Lion existed as a plan, even if it never materialized. If German forces attempted a landing along the southern coast, artillery batteries like Fan Bay would have been among the first to engage and among the first to be targeted. A shelter capable of sustaining crews for extended periods would allow guns to remain active even if resupply was delayed or surface structures damaged. In this reading, the shelter is not extraordinary. It is thorough. A place designed to keep men functional not for hours, but for weeks. A third hypothesis combines both ideas into a broader doctrine: preparation for worst-case continuity. British military planning in this period favored redundancy, not because leadership believed catastrophe was inevitable, but because it could not be ruled out. Fan Bay Deep Shelter fits within that mindset. It is neither extravagant nor minimal. It is sufficient. Sufficient depth, sufficient power, sufficient space. Enough to endure a scenario no one wanted to name openly, but everyone understood. None of these explanations require secret weapons or forbidden technologies. Everything found at Fan Bay aligns with what was possible in the early 1940s. Concrete steel generators wiring human labor. The complexity does not point to hidden innovation. It points to fear disciplined by engineering. Fear translated into structure. And yet, each hypothesis leaves something unresolved. If command continuity was the goal, why is there no clear evidence of communications, infrastructure, on the scale one might expect? If prolonged habitation was anticipated, why were living conditions kept so austere, even by wartime standards? And if this was simply a defensive measure against invasion, why do some spaces appear more carefully planned than strictly necessary for that function? These questions resist definitive answers because they exist in the space between planning and execution. Wartime construction often outpaced documentation. Decisions were made quickly, revised quietly, and sometimes abandoned before their purpose fully materialized. What was built did not always match what was intended. What was intended was not always recorded. This uncertainty demands restraint. It is tempting to push the narrative further, to imagine hidden agendas or unacknowledged missions. but the evidence does not support that leap. Fan Bay does not reveal secrets in the dramatic sense. It reveals caution taken seriously, preparation carried out without optimism, a belief that survival depended not on ingenuity alone, but on the willingness to imagine failure and build for it. What remains difficult to ignore is that not all of Fan Bay has been made available for scrutiny. Certain sections remain closed. Certain plans remain partial. Military records related to specific operational details have not been fully released. This does not imply concealment of wrongdoing, but it does acknowledge the limits of what can be known from what is shown. Some doors were never meant to be opened casually. Some decisions were recorded only in context that has since dissolved. The shelter stands as evidence of planning shaped by pressure, urgency, and uncertainty, conditions under which not everything is explained, and not everything survives in written form. History, in this case, offers boundaries rather than answers. Not every passage is illuminated, not every purpose is clarified, and not every door is opened, even after the war has ended. In 2015, Fan Bay Deep Shelter reopened, not as a military installation, but as a place to be walked through, studied, and slowly understood. Visitors now descend the same spiral stairway, once used by artillery crews, with their footsteps echoing in corridors that have not changed shape since the war. The temperature remains constant. The air still carries salt and damp. Water still gathers along the edges of the floor. Time has passed, but the shelter has not moved with it. People walk where others once slept, waited, and returned between shifts at the guns. They pause beside iron bunk frames. They trace the grooves worn into steps by decades-old boots. They read names scratched into walls by men who had no way of knowing whether anyone would ever read them again. The shelter allows this quiet contact with the past, but only to a point. Certain passages remain closed. Certain doors stay locked. There are spaces visitors are not meant to enter, areas acknowledged only by absence and omission. The shelter is open, but not fully revealed. That partial openness is its final lesson. Fan Bay does not exist to commemorate victory. It offers no triumphant ending, no decisive moment where the story resolves itself cleanly. Instead, it preserves a state of readiness, of anticipation, held in concrete and chalk. It tells a story about a country that did not know how the war would end, only that it had to remain standing long enough to find out. The shelter represents a form of courage rarely highlighted in history. Not the courage of advance, but the courage of preparation, the willingness to imagine disaster and build accordingly, the acceptance that survival might depend less on brilliance than on endurance. Fan Bay was not built to inspire. It was built to function when inspiration failed. This is where its meaning settles. War is often remembered through battles and turning points, through dates that mark victory or defeat. But those outcomes are shaped elsewhere in spaces like this one, quiet, hidden, uncelebrated. Places where people prepare to hold on rather than push forward. Places designed to absorb shock rather than deliver it. War is not decided only on battlefields, but in the places where people prepare to survive when everything else collapses. And if you want to continue opening doors that history kept closed for decades, stay here. A